Well, hi, everybody. Again, our guest today is Bella Englebach. Let me tell you a little bit about Bella. She is the lead consultant at her firm she calls Lean for Humans. The website is leanforhumans.com. She is host of a podcast called The Edges of Lean. And it says on your LinkedIn profile, Bella, that you are creating better organizations where the music of the human spirit sings.
Yes.
That's a beautiful phrase. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
First off, I should do that.
Thanks so much.
Where does that phrase come from? That's lovely.
So that phrase actually came from a workshop that I did with Karen Ross, who's a friend of yours and mine, and we were doing a workshop on finding your own voice and purpose. And I won't give you all the details of what happened, but the tagline came out of there. What I was really trying to express was, you can work in an organization where you just feel dead inside. And I think we've all had the opportunity, or I don't know if you call it an opportunity, to do that. And then you can work in an organization where you can feel that you are very much appreciated and affirmed, and especially that your ideas can be moved forward, and that your ideas can move the organization forward. So, that provides a kind of fulfillment that I think a lot of people don't have. So, what I was thinking about, what is it that I really want to do with Lean for Humans? It is about that. It's about helping people create the kind of organization that feels safe enough and open enough to innovation, that people do feel that the human spirit can actually get out there and belt out a little song.
Now, I'm not putting you on the spot. Do you sing, or that's just a phrase that resonated with you?
I am an amateur singer. I've sung in a choir for a long, long time. I've taken voice lessons off and on. I'm currently taking voice lessons because as one gets a little older, the voice changes. So it's good to have some lessons and kind of buff things up. And my granddaughter, who I could talk about for hours, and I'm sure the listeners don't want to hear about, is almost 10, and she's just started taking voice lessons. So having a lot of fun seeing her start to learn things that I wish I had learned many years ago.
But there's it seems a parallel that we could draw to Lean and to Toyota Kata, or whatever phrases you're using, about this need for ongoing learning or fine-tuning or relearning things that we thought we already knew how to do, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love the little things they had that you get when you go to something like the Kata Con. I am a little bit of a Kata aficionado. And so one of my favorites is this little thing they hand out that says, "Don't be so sure." Yeah. And one of the things that I have learned in taking voice lessons, again, now at my age, is a lot of the things I thought were the right things to do for good vocal production, either they never worked or they don't work for me now. So, having to relearn, learn new technique, learn technique perhaps that's come along, is really interesting. And I pass that stuff on to my granddaughter. I say, I just had this conversation with my teacher, and she said, do it this way. My granddaughter looks at me, she just sings, and she looks at me like I'm a little bit silly.
So is it a matter of what works for each voice? Like I do not sing. I've never had any training. I haven't even ever tried.
Well, I'm not qualified to answer that question, but I know certainly there are things in terms of the mechanics of the voice that probably apply to everybody. And then for individuals, everybody's anatomy is a little bit different, and the quality of the machinery and how well it's been maintained is a little bit different. So there might be different things that you have to do. So one of the things that I've been really learning about is the concept of vocal placement. That is, where is your voice actually sort of coming from in your mouth? And that is probably going to feel different for different people because their anatomy is different. And then I think for people who sing different types of singing, there are certainly things that are going to be different. I sing mostly classical. I'm learning to sing jazz, which is a wonderful new experience for me.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Well, I mean, that's anything worthwhile has its difficulties, and I feel like, and I don't mean to be encroaching on your space of the edges of lean, but I feel like even in talking about singing here, we're on the edges of lean, because when it comes to things like learning and practice and, like, having a teacher who guides you, and there's this balance of like learning from an expert or a sensei or whatever word you might use, and going and trying something and seeing what works for you. So maybe, to bring it back more directly to the core of lean, like, when you're coaching people, how do you find that balance between learning from somebody like yourself versus going and experimenting and trying things?
That's a really good question. And as a coach, I feel that I am sometimes a bad coach, and I tell my clients, I say, you're going to get some bad coaching right now, because the bad coaching is when I tell people things, right? The bad coaching is when I say, in my experience, this happened to me, and this is how I handled it. And this is what happened when that happened to me. That's bad coaching, right? That's my experience. It's about a different time, a different place. And maybe there's a principle that my client can glean from that, and maybe there's not. The good coaching is when we just, I ask them, what do you think? What do you think is happening here? What is the current situation? What do you see going on right now? What do you think you know about that? And particularly because coaching often seems to come back to, how do I in my environment relate to other people? Now, and I'm not a therapist, I can't do the therapy stuff, but a lot of it seems to come down to assumptions, where people are making assumptions about other people and their intentions. And so, having to ask the question, well, how do you know that? How do you know that that's what that person is really thinking? That's what's really driving them. And then what experiment could we do, or could you do, to test out what you think is actually happening? And that's where I see people making a tremendous amount of learning, when they do something. And we never try to do an experiment that is going to hurt another person, but will help us understand more about that other person. Because when it comes down to people's happiness and success, so much of it does have to do with how they relate to other people. So lean for humans. It and I think I have to be careful about saying we do experiments on people, because we don't do experiments on people. That's not what I mean. It's if you go in with this intention and you say something in this way, or show them this thing, what do you think's going to happen? And then what actually happened? Well, what did you learn from that? Which is very much a Toyota Kata type of approach.
Right. And we ended up on this topic. I was going to mention something that was on your website. It was kind of feedback, if not well, it was an endorsement, I'll call it that, from one of your clients, where it says, in his words, Bella does not tell you what to do. She leads you down the path where you can discover it yourself. Now, there's kind of a meta question around that. Did somebody at some point tell you to coach that way, or did you discover that yourself, that it's more effective to help lead others down a path?
Well, I worked inside a company, a big company, for many, many years. And so I did a lot of mentoring, and I was a manager of people. And so I thought I was coaching. I didn't really know what coaching was. So that was definitely something that I learned in coaching. But it's very much framed by what I also had been practicing in terms of lean thinking. And so a book that for me was just kind of earth-shaking is Managing to Learn by John Shook. Right. And a lot of people think that's a book about how you fill out an A3. But as a manager, right, as someone who's managing people, what was really important to me was it's this conversation between the learner and the manager. And I was very interested in what was happening in the manager's head, and how the manager had to keep pulling back from telling. And now, when I was working in the big company, there was a lot in that environment that was pushing me towards, you got to tell your people what to do, tell them what to do. And so I was always trying. And I think that my employees, if you talk to one of my former employees, they would say the same thing, that Bella, whenever it was possible, let you solve the problem yourself and treated it as a learning experience. It was not always possible to do that in that particular corporate environment. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's expectations of the leaders you report to. There's the prevailing culture that you're a part of. There's maybe only so much you can do as an individual if you're wanting to lead by asking questions, or I think there's the flip side. I'm curious to hear your thoughts or experiences around this. There's definitely the habit you mentioned of telling people what to do. People, I think, also get conditioned to be told what to do, and they may, on some level, they may not like that, but it's the norm. It's what's comfortable. It sort of takes risk away from me if I'm doing, well, Bella told me to do it. I didn't think it was a good idea, but I did it anyway. How do you help? How do you get out of that?
Well, I think the thing is, if you are a manager, and one thing that I would like to say about my coaching practice is that's kind of my favorite place to coach. I know a lot of people coach CEOs and C-suite people. That's great. I love to coach people in the middle layer because I really feel that they have the hardest time, right? Because it's what you talked about, Mark. You kind of get crunched. You've got people from the top handing down directives, and then you've got people at the bottom who are trying to do their job, and you've got to manage with all of that, and it can feel like a really, really tough place. So the thing then is to figure out, well, how do you create experiments that allow people to start to build confidence, right? So just do some little thing, see what happens, and then you could move on to a bigger thing. And it's a little bit like, when you have actually like raising children. First the child's allowed to walk to the end of the driveway, and they gain some confidence going to the end of the driveway. Well, now they can walk down to the corner, but you gotta walk to the end of the driveway first, come back to the house, make sure you know where the front door is. So I think it's about really trying to focus on doing small experiments, small changes. And then also for the manager, that's very hard, right? So for the manager, they have to start to feel comfortable letting people do that. Because if they have been raised in this very hierarchical way of working, then it's going to be very hard for them to let go. And it'll go against their internal expectations, and they have to examine their internal expectations. And there can be like really big ahas there.
Yeah. And it's tough in my experience when leaders are trying to empower their people, or the leaders are trying to get comfortable with the idea that they're going to empower their people, and they'll say, well, what if they have bad ideas? Well, I think there's this balance of, as you've alluded to it, if somebody suggests something that only the manager realizes is unsafe or against regulations, or like there is, I think, a time and a place for a leader to step in and call timeout, and not just say don't do that, but do some coaching and some education about why that's a problem. But I found like it's really rare instances where one of those criteria might be met. If you have a conversation with a leader of like, well, if they try such and such and it doesn't work, what's the worst that could happen?
Right.
Fair thing to ask.
Well, yeah, that is a really good question. So what's the worst that could happen? What's interesting, I wonder if you ever get this answer, is something really dire where the person that you're coaching, the manager, is now going to catastrophize the situation, right?
Sure.
So then you have to have a further conversation about how likely is that, so it's a risk analysis.
It's an FMEA analysis.
Exactly. It's an FMEA. It's like, how likely is this actually to happen? It could be catastrophic, but how likely is that to happen?
Yeah.
But The thing that and I wrote about this, this in my book, the thing that we really have to be aware of is that we can react about things, particularly when we're in that position of feeling like we have to hold on. We're crushed in between, the rock and the hard place, the bosses and the employees who need help. We can react without understanding where our reaction's coming from. Yeah. So, right. So because of some internalized bad memory. And then if it's me, then I'm coming up with excuses as to why that happened, and really have to take time to sit back and reflect. Okay, why did I react in that way?
Yeah. Well, and I could see where, and I guess I was saying it's between, just between us. When I say what's the worst that could happen, that's not really the right way to ask it. So I appreciate your gentle pushback on that, because that does sound a little combative. But to get to the core of well, what is the risk here? That conversation could be had. And I do apologize for not mentioning your book. Bella's book came out in 2019, Creatively Lean: How to Get Out of Your Own Way and Drive Innovation Through Your Organization. So I apologize for my sloppiness in the
no problem.
Introductions here today, but good job in mentioning the book. An author has to mention their book.
Well, we would have got the podcast in, right? So,
well, yeah. So we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. So I want to come back to a question. I tried to mix things up a little bit today. I often ask this as the very first question about, a lean origin story, or whatever phrase or lingo, was being used in that origin. Bella, what's your lean origin story? How did you get involved in process improvement, or whatever we're calling it?
So how much time do you have? I mean, how long is this podcast?
We do pretty long podcasts. We have time.
All right. So I started my career in a research lab. I started in academia, and then I went to a pharmaceutical company research lab. And from there, I ended up moving to medical writing. So if in a pharmaceutical company, one of the things that medical writing does is help to write the applications that go into the health authorities, like the FDA. So I'd be working in a lab that had been doing discovery, was coming up with new drugs and testing new drugs in animals. And then all of a sudden, I was propelled to the other end of the process. And I have to tell you, I was not a process thinker. But suddenly, I saw the impact of everything that everybody did, because we were putting these together into a new drug application to go to the FDA. From there, I went to a very small consulting company as a writer, because I had this experience as a medical writer. And one day they came to me and they said, Bella, we would like you to write standard operating procedures. And I was like, I don't know anything about standard operating procedures. But, in a small company, you do all kinds of interesting things. So I spent quite a few years going from one pharmaceutical company to another, basically saying to people, okay, so now what do you do? What do you do next? Is there a decision point here? Making process maps and writing those down into procedural documents. So nobody was actually thinking about improving them at the time, but I spent all this time just writing down process, hearing how companies did things. And then a guy was hired by a company who was doing business process reengineering. So I don't know if you remember that book, it was a long time ago. So he came in and so I got on one of his teams, and we were doing business process reengineering. I had no idea what I was doing. But that seemed to be, you go into the companies and you ask the same questions, but then you ask an additional question is, how could we make this better? Right? So that was it. So that's kind of my origin story. From there, I ended up being hired back by a pharmaceutical company. And one day I was doing this sort of business process reengineering, and my phone rang, and there was somebody on the other end who was from our manufacturing organization. And he said, Bella, I want to introduce myself. Have you ever heard of Six Sigma? He said, the company wants everybody to be doing Six Sigma as a methodology. So, we got trained on Six Sigma. And because I was really working in R&D, I found it didn't really work all that well in R&D for lots of reasons. And then, but we kind of plugged along. And then I also learned creative problem solving and spent a lot of time trying to think about how does Six Sigma and creative problem solving work together. That's almost what my book is about. And then one day I met somebody who was doing lean in labs. So basically, typical production just system lean in laboratories, and that just totally blew my mind. And
Meaning, again, research laboratories.
yeah, research laboratories, but the kind of research laboratories that were doing multiple assays that were similar to each other, right? So not necessarily discovery laboratory where you might be doing some, different experiments over the course of several months, but the kind of laboratory where you're going to be testing something over and over and over again.
Oh, okay.
Because that kind of lab is very amenable to TPS type improvements.
Yeah, because that starts sounding a little bit more like a medical laboratory that might be in a hospital or a freestanding laboratory where they're doing tests on blood and other patient samples. And some of that tends to be very high volume and pretty repetitive and automated and production-like.
Yeah, and you see these things where somebody's, will go into a lab and they go, Bella, this is so cool. We just bought this new robot that can pipette, I don't know, some vast number of samples all at once. I say, wow, that's really cool. What happens to the samples when they're pipetted? They go, they go in the freezer till we can actually test them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. There's so many habits. There's that habit of telling people. There's the habit of batching.
Yes.
That we see in so many different settings. You're just triggering a different memory of the largest centrifuge I ever saw was in, a hospital laboratory. It probably held over 100 specimens, and I was used to seeing centrifuges that would hold maybe more like 24, and there were a lot of labs that would get down to using ones that held maybe 6. Yep. Right, so smaller batches. It's like having a lot of different air fryers on a table instead of one big oven, if you will, to use a food analogy. And watching and somebody was talking through the process, and we're observing. Specimen goes into the centrifuge, and then how long does it sit there? Until the centrifuge is full.
Right.
And
100 samples later, yep.
Yeah. Now, it wouldn't make sense to run 2 at a time, but it was a system design problem. Like that one large centrifuge could have been replaced with many smaller centrifuges that would have allowed flow. But I think this is where, when you think back to what you were describing with business process reengineering or with Lean, as much as we talk about teams improving their own work, there's something to be said for fresh eyes coming in and challenging something. Like they would just take for granted, like, well, that's the way we've always done it. And you think, oh, red flag. Well, how could we make it better? There's back to that other questions. So,
and I think that's a really hard balance. And I've always found that to be a really hard balance, and particularly in that type of situation. You come in, and you just know, right? Your training, your experiences teach you that a big batch is probably going to be less efficient and less effective than a small batch, right? So there's a tug. So part of it would be, well, I could just tell them, get rid of the big centrifuge and put in some small centrifuges, or we could do all of this work for months and months and months, and eventually they'll figure it out for themselves. And that's kind of where that management pressure comes in too, right? Because management's just saying, okay, this lab is holding up the work that we're trying to do. We need to make this lab work better now. So at some point there is, some teaching. And one of the things that we found with labs over the years and working with them was that really level flow was incredibly important. Right. A workload leveling was incredibly important because there's this very volatile workload coming in, and then it was leading to lots and lots of lost samples. So actually teaching people about how to identify the different types of work they had in their process and helping them to figure out how to create a nice, steady cadence for the things that happen most often is hugely beneficial.
Yeah.
Very hard for people to get their minds around because they were so used to living in a panic environment.
Right. Yeah.
But so we had some folks, actually brought some folks in who were very, very good at that, and it was remarkable the improvements that we could make in the labs. But to go back to the people side, a lot of those improvements, I'm sorry to say, were not sustained because we didn't spend enough time working with the managers about, well, how do you manage this? How do you maintain it? And how do you maintain a continuous improvement environment in this lab so you can get better? And we did not spend enough time doing that.
Yeah. And I think one of my reflections of, I've never really worked under the banner of BPR or business process reengineering, but as an industrial engineer, I was kind of put in a similar situation of what you're describing of watching people and documenting what they're doing, or, and even timing it, asking them how they do it. And that's not as effective as, taking the opportunity to show people how to document their own work, but then also do so in a way, where I, think back early in my career, like, oh my gosh, the engineer with the stopwatch and a clipboard, how scary and threatening that can be, because what happens with that information? Oh, management's trying to get rid of people. And, that, I think that's one of the shifts from either doing industrial engineering to people, or bringing in BPR versus engaging people in Lean. Like, there's got to be some foundation of trust with the humans, back to the name of your company, Lean for Humans. We can engage people, and like you're saying, it leads to better outcomes and more sustainable outcomes when it's their improvement.
Yes, I mean, because they know it and they love it, and they've had that satisfaction of doing it themselves. It makes such a big difference.
Yeah. So going back to when you talk about Six Sigma in R&D labs, I mean, that's something that gets said a lot. Like, if you even look at companies like 3M, and when a company like that struggles, and some people have blamed Six Sigma for that, oh, Six Sigma interfered with innovation. And my point's not to bash Six Sigma, but I'm just curious, getting a little bit more detail. Like, when you say that didn't work in R&D, was it just because it wasn't a high volume process to do some of the defect per million opportunities kind
that's
of
that's exactly
yeah.
That was exactly it. Like, so I was spent learning the math and, learning the software, and then you just don't do anything often enough to get the numbers, right? And then the other big problem for us, for the same reason, was really like getting to a control stage, right? So you can't control and have run charts if, 6 weeks later you're going to switch to another project and do things in a different way. And I saw, we did go through the whole thing of belt training and everything, and I saw so many green belts and aspiring black belts really frustrated by the fact that they could never get to control, because being R&D, we moved on to something else, and that was, it was very difficult in that environment. But one of the things that I was really thinking about at the time, because I was learning the creative problem solving methodology at the same time that we were implementing Six Sigma in research and development in this company, was that there seemed to be a lot of overlap. So there was, started with trying to understand a problem, and then eventually trying to figure out what to do to solve the problem. But the two methodologies, I couldn't find any way, at least then, where the two methodologies had really been brought together so you could have the benefits of both. And one of the things that was most striking to me was that in my company, we actually, with the I in DMAIC, we talked about it as being not just improvement, but innovative improvement. But we never taught any of our belts, how do you actually get to something innovative? Which is, another set of approaches and tools and ways of thinking. So we said innovative improvement, but we didn't know what innovative improvement meant. Right. So that was, I think that was the other thing. And then, as happens with belt programs, People got a little bored with it. Some people from corporate were always coming in saying, well, how much money have you saved? And we weren't actually as interested in saving money as we were in building capacity to do more R&D. Right.
Yeah.
So we were always having an argument about that. So So I wouldn't say that Six Sigma is useless.
No.
It's just
I wouldn't say that either.
Not well suited for that environment.
Yeah. And I'm no expert on 3M. I'm not an expert on Six Sigma, and it might surprise listener to hear me defending Six Sigma, but it just always feels like that's an excuse. If 3M indeed was having innovation problems, was that correlation with Six Sigma? Was that really truly cause and effect? And if Six Sigma was really hurting innovation, there would have been a need to change the Six Sigma approach. Like I don't like giving a methodology too much credit or letting it be the fall guy. I mean, I think it comes down to the leaders, the people running the company.
Yeah, and are you asking the questions that allow people to try things out? And I think that was the rap, right? I don't remember all that much about it, but that was the rap, was that 3M used to be this place where people actually had time to sit and play with things and noodle on stuff, and once they got into Six Sigma, it was not so much the approach, but the drive for efficiency meant that they had to use their time differently. And that's about the corporate ethos of the implementation, not the approach itself.
Yeah, I don't think there would be anything in the Six Sigma handbook that would have dictated that shift in culture or measures that were driving a change in behavior.
Yeah, it'd be good to have someone from 3M weigh in on this, I think.
Sure. Somebody who had been there. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned a couple of times as a methodology, creative problem solving. That's not something I'm really familiar with either. Can give us a summary of like what makes that a specific methodology?
Creative problem solving came out of work that was done in the late 40s and early 50s by a guy. And I always have to make sure I get his name right. I talk about him in my book, and I always get his name slightly wrong. That he was really focused. He was an advertising executive, and he was really concerned with or interested in making advertising more effective. And advertising in those days was all about, if I'm selling you a new refrigerator, I'm going to show you all the features of my new refrigerator, right? Yeah. And his question really was, well, how can we have advertising that's more exciting, more interesting, and it entices people? So Alex Osborne. Alex Osborne was this executive, and he's the one who actually was involved in the creation of what we now think of as brainstorming. What Osborne really started to investigate was divergent thinking, which is allowing yourself to think of many different ideas and options. Right. And what kind of environment was needed for divergent thinking? He also wanted to know what kind of people were good at divergent thinking, because if you get it, so you can see the movement there from, here's my refrigerator. I'm going to tell you my refrigerator has 3 shelves, to the kind of advertising we see at the Super Bowl today, where maybe it's gone so it's so divergent that sometimes you don't know what the ad's about, right? Yeah. But there was a pathway there. So he was very interested in divergent thinking, and he partnered with a psychologist named Sid Perns, and they developed a methodology to help particularly people in this advertising agency, but other people, get more and more comfortable and learn how to think divergently and come up with ideas. And I guess at some point they realized, hey, it doesn't do you any good to come up with ideas if you don't actually implement them. So then they also started to work on convergent thinking. Convergent thinking is where you select ideas, you strengthen them, and you carry them forward. And so creative problem solving is a series of learning cycles. I had a conversation with a CPS person the other day, and they said, it's not learning cycles, it's a process. And I said, I know, they are learning cycles. It's a series of learning cycles that always go from divergent thinking to convergent thinking, right? So you think of a lot of ideas, and then you pick something to move forward with, and then you find out there are problems with that idea, and so you make it stronger by thinking divergently about what needs to happen to make it stronger, and then you pick 2 or 3 solutions to move forward with, and then finally you're going to implement it, right? So there's going to be some, laying the groundwork to do that, lots of options, and then you're going to decide how you're going to move forward. And in all of that, you're collecting what they call data, which is information about the world as you go through these cycles. That's why I think they're learning cycles. Even though if there's any CPS people listening, they're probably going to say, Bella, no, it's a process. And I strongly believe they're learning cycles. So you can use these learning cycles either in the CPS methodology, which is a series of steps that have this divergent and convergent thinking, or why not use it with PDCA? Right? Why not use it in your A3? Why not use it in DMAIC? So when you go into innovative improvement, that I step, what's that thing you're going to come up with? Well, you could actually apply some CPS thinking, some divergent thinking and convergent thinking to that step. And so in the end, after I've been done all this thinking and working on it and teaching it to people and writing a book about it, somebody said to me, well, haven't you just reinvented design thinking? I said, well, maybe I have. I don't know. But it just seems to me that, there are all these methodologies that people use.
Yeah.
And everybody holds on very firmly. This is my methodology. This is how I do it. I do Toyota Cut, or we're all about PDCA over here. No, it's PDSA. Or,
right.
You see, all of the arguments, right?
Mm-hmm.
But very few of them, I think, really take advantage of, do we understand how to come up with new ideas to broaden our thinking so that we could see what we need to see, which is, coming up with multiple potential root causes is a divergent activity.
Yeah.
And then, because most of us are much more comfortable with convergent thinking, which is why Alex Oswald in the beginning really focused on divergent thinking, because he saw everybody around him was all about convergent thinking and making choices. So.
Yeah, and that's Alex, who's pretty well known in lean startup entrepreneurship circles. Am I thinking of the right person?
Well, this is, I don't, no, there was an advertising executive in the 1930s, late 1940s, then 50s, yeah. So.
Oh, okay, so it's a similar name, I think, or close enough, Alex Osterwalder. Okay.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Okay.
And that's why I have a hard time remembering his name, because I mix it up with Alex Osterwalder, who does great. I love his stuff, by the way. Yeah.
So, it seems like there's a difference in approach. Creative problem solving without implementation could maybe be described as creative solution generation. Well, that solution, that comes back to your sticker, don't be so sure. When people say, this is a lesson I've been fortunate to learn, I'll credit Pascal Dennis for this, the idea of saying we found the root cause. Oh, well, how do you know that's the root cause? Well, we talked about it in a room and we're all really sure that that's the root cause. That's where that sticker would be helpful, right? Don't be so sure.
Don't be so sure.
There needs to be action to help test or disprove. You have a hypothesis of a root cause, just as you might have a hypothesis that this solution is going to be helpful. Hence, don't be so sure. Go test
do
it.
the experiment.
Yeah, do the experiment.
Yeah, do the experiment. Yeah. So in creative problem solving, the first step is clarify the problem, which is what we would call root cause analysis.
Right.
Now what
the
are you
first step
seeing?
in an A3, maybe.
Yeah. Exactly. So it's get as much information as you can about the problem. What is all the stuff that we know? And then, I would get into arguments with the CPS people, because what I call data, and Mark, what you would call data and what they call data there wasn't always an overlap,
Yeah.
you know. So then I would say, you just because somebody said something doesn't mean it's true, right? Don't you put that on a
How do you
sticky, and
know
when
this?
we're
Yeah.
not going to solve the problem based on that, because right, Mark, you don't really know it. You got to go and see what's really going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, that was. So I spent a lot of time when I'm talking with my CPS friends. They would say, "Well, you know, we know you're into that Six Sigma lean quality management stuff, but you know, we'll talk to you anyway." And then there would be, you know, all my Six Sigma lean friends, and they'd say, you know, "Oh, there you're going off on the creativity stuff again." And to me, it just seemed so important that they work together.
Yeah. So then in the career journey, when did your work and what you were exposed to and taught become lean? You know, you're talking about going through Six Sigma, and then I feel like we need to come back to that story.
So what happened was, my company put on a conference for all of us people who were doing what we were then calling process excellence. And so we were called to company headquarters, and we had this amazing conference. And Jerry Velasco was there. I don't know if you know Jerry.
I do.
So Jerry was there, and he was talking about some lab projects, some lab work they had been doing out of orthoclinical at that time.
Orthoclinical diagnostics. I worked
there. Right. And I was just, after we'd just been struggling with all this black belt, green belt stuff, and the projects that, you know, really we couldn't get them to finish because we couldn't get to control. And Jerry was there talking about what they were doing in labs and with their clients, and I was just like, all right, this is the stuff we have to do. So we actually brought Jerry and his team in, and they did our first lean lab project.
Oh, small world.
And yeah. So we did that project, and it was, you know, we got incredible results out of it. But as I said, you know, it wasn't sustainable because we didn't work enough on the people side of it. You know, that was my learning afterwards. We should have worked on the people side much harder.
Yeah.
But we got these great results. And one of the things that really helped, that was really important about that, was that we had a very important filing that was going to go into the FDA. And this one particular lab looked like they were going to hold that filing up. And a lot of people were not happy. And so by helping this lab, we got this drug to the market when it was supposed to be. And it was, you know, it was very, very cool. I was very excited. So then we did a few more projects like that, and we went to a conference on lean pharmaceutical R&D. So we were there, and the other big pharma companies were there, and everybody presented their project, and we all presented the same project, which was basically we went into some part of R&D that looked like operations where you could apply TPS and you got great results. I'm sitting there thinking about this. I'm thinking, you know, there's something wrong here. It's just not right. And Terry Barnhart was chairing that conference. At the end of the conference, he had sort of a sit around and talk about what you think about the conference session. And I said, you know, I don't know that we're really helping pharmaceutical R&D. I said, we're dealing with this massively long drug development process.
Right.
You know, it can be like, everyone says 6, 8, 10 years, but honestly, Mark, it can be up to 17, 18 years to go from discovery lab to really, you know, being in patients. I said, I don't know that fixing these operational pieces is going to really help us. So we need to have something that fixes the innovation side of it.
Sure.
How we do the innovation. And everybody kind of looked at me like I was really nuts because they were happy with all of the projects and everything that they had been doing. And I went back to work after that conference, and I opened up Google and I typed in lean product development. And that was when I really discovered the whole sort of field of lean product development. And then, you know, if you think that those first lab projects blew me away, what I started to read about lean product development, you know, how Toyota's product development really is what drives the value of Toyota.
Mm-hmm.
The manufacturing is fantastic, but the value comes from the product development. I was completely stunned. So then I had a really big sales job to do, right?
Yeah.
So I ended up bringing Michael Kennedy in to sit with a bunch of biology people. He's an engineer, and this was a bunch of PhDs, MDs, and we sat in a room for I think about 2 days and tried to understand each other. And at the end, it was they understood well enough to allow us to start to try some experiments.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of where we got started. Now I got to say, now that I'm no longer with the company, and we, as these things go, you've seen, we sort of implementation, and then, organizational change, and then another implementation, org change. I don't know how much of what we worked on still exists
Sure.
in that particular company. But
yeah. Well, I mean, what you're describing there, what you were asking questions about, doesn't sound crazy. It sounds insightful. Like, are we solving the right problem? Are we solving the biggest problem that really matters to the core of the business, right? So in healthcare delivery, there are all sorts of lean projects that work on one part of a department, like you're describing, like, oh, well, here's an application. This seems like operations, and we're going to apply TPS to it. Then we step back and say, well, how many patients are being harmed? How many patients are dying due to preventable medical errors? Maybe we should be applying this problem solving to things like medication errors and surgical errors. And I think at some point we've got to step back and ask, like, are we really are we applying people's time and skills and brain power and creativity to the right problems? And those might be harder to solve, but they're worth tackling.
I mean, what you're saying about healthcare is really interesting, because what I'm seeing in healthcare now is this massive rejection of a lot of what has been done, right? And you were talking about before about the old industrial engineer standing there with the stopwatch. Mm-hmm. That's what a lot of people seem to think that Lean is. Lean is about a guy standing there with a stopwatch. It's about telling people they've only got 15 minutes to do something they think takes half an hour,
right.
And it's about taking away their flexibility when it comes to crisis level supplies. And you've talked about that a lot. But what's the real problem in healthcare? The real problem in healthcare is massive. And it's about disconnection and how people get paid.
We could step back, and people with more of a public health orientation would say, stop just trying to make the hospital less error prone. Let's keep people healthy so that they don't need to come. So like, oh, okay, you're right.
Yep.
I mean, we could step back and look at the whole situation from many different levels, but important stuff. But so, the people, and when you talk about engaging the people, supporting people, working with people, that clearly has inspired you. Like, what was the moment where you came up with the name of your company, Lean for Humans, and what that means to you?
I don't know if I can remember exactly the moment that I came up with it, but I needed to form a company because I had a client, so I needed a company so I could get paid. This is what happens sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, I have to call this company something. And because I am so passionate about it being really for the benefit of people, I think that just popped into my head, and then I looked to see whether there were any other companies called Lean for Humans, and there weren't, so I was able to get the name. So I did want to distinguish myself on what I do from the very valuable people who will come in and will teach you how to do 5S.
Sure.
And that's really, really good stuff. But I really want to get into, in the work that I do, how do we treat each other? Mm-hmm. How do we listen to each other, and how do we get better in that? And I got to tell you, I'm not any better than any other human being at doing any of those things, right? I'm still practicing. I'm still practicing, and I'm still learning. Yes, that's the sort of people I say, well, who's your ideal client? My ideal client is someone who already realizes that the way they're behaving in their organization as a manager or a leader isn't going to cut it going forward. And I think this, so-called great resignation is really should be saying to company leadership, you've got something really going on here that is not the right thing, right? The way that you've done this in the past isn't going to work going forward.
So I'm going to plug another podcast series of mine. Jamie Flinchbaugh and I just had a long conversation over a pour of whiskey in episode 32 of our Lean Whiskey podcast, talking about the Great Resignation and things he's written about in the subject, and talking about this idea of don't blame the people who are resigning.
Yeah.
You need to look at your own culture and practices and things that would drive people to even think about leaving.
Exactly. And it's hard, right? Because holding that mirror up to ourselves is very difficult. So that's the downside of doing that. It's probably going to hurt a bit.
So I wanted to ask you also, I like asking about names, and in your podcast, The Edges of Lean.
Yeah.
Like, how do you define the edges of lean for people who haven't listened to the episodes? Where do you find people at the edges of lean?
Wait, it's funny having named the podcast that we almost always come back to the same thing, which is people, right? We always almost always come back to that. So I'm interested on the podcast. I'm interested in two things. One is people who are doing lean in places, or something that they call lean, in places that are not typical manufacturing operations environments. And we know there's lots of people who are doing that, but many of them feel as if they're a little bit, they're stepchildren a little bit, It mystifies me. I still see people writing blog posts like, do you know you can use lean in the office? I was like, well, yes, people have been doing it for 15 years, but we don't talk to each other about it, right? So you think it's something really, really avant-garde and out there. But the other thing I'm interested in is all these things that are kind of like CPS that probably should be in somebody who's practicing Lean's toolkit. So, things like collaboration skills. Well, so we know in order to really achieve a change among a group of people, you're going to have some great collaboration. Well, how do you actually get that? And the person who can tell us about that may or may not be someone that we think of as being a lean practitioner. So I like to bring in people who don't think of themselves as being part of our world and have a conversation with them. And then there are people who are kind of like in this other place, who are practicing probably things that we would think of as being very lean, but they've never heard of lean, or they don't call it lean because the principles are so universal. And so we can learn something from them as well. So people in the military who learn the OODA loop, observe, orient,
John Boyd was the...
that kind of stuff. The John Boyd stuff. That is, there's some lean in there. Okay, so how are they looking at it, and how are they using it, and what can we learn from them? So the edges are pretty broad, but we almost always come back to talking about people.
Yeah. So when you say, with your company, Lean for Humans, putting people at the center, it's funny that exploring the edges helps us rediscover the core. How's that?
Yeah, I love it. And that's exactly what happens in a lot of the conversations. Yeah.
And so I think I love the idea. And I mean, there are times where I think I dabble in the edges of lean, or like episode 437, most recently, Peter Docker, who is from the Royal Air Force, talking about leadership and moving away from command and control into, training people and then empowering them and trusting them. Like, that I had him on the podcast because I think, as you were saying, it's very reminiscent of lean. It's inspiring to those of us who are working through and for people, for their benefit, to bring out ideas we could say that's lean adjacent, but there's something extra that comes into the fold.
Yeah, it'll, some of these things are going to help you with your practice of lean. And even if they don't, I'm a big believer in feeding your brain with ideas that you think are not important now because they may be important later. Yeah.
That could be, again, like singing lessons or relearning how to sing, what benefit, what insights come to you from learning and practicing something new. I think there's great benefit to being in a position where you're learning or relearning. I think it's good for your brain, but it's also a good reminder when you're in the position of being a coach or a trainer, what it feels like to be the student.
So my granddaughter actually has a visual board for her singing lessons.
What is on that?
Well, it's a little crazy right now because it's been with various things going on. But she has a goal that she wants to achieve, and I'm kind of letting her design it herself. So she is breaking up her work into small pieces, and she gets to check off her work when it's done. It's mostly a checklist right now, and was the thing that she's really learning how to do is to observe herself, which is something I think that many of us don't know. So the question that I ask her and her voice teacher asks is, how did that feel?
Yeah.
And start to reflect on what you just did. How did that feel? What do you think happened? What did you like about it? So something is done when she likes what she's done, whether or not we think it's good.
But again, there's a parallel to coaching adult humans in the workplace.
Exactly. Yeah.
Younger grandchild humans. So
yes.
So much, so many thought-provoking ideas out of the conversation today, Bella. So again, I encourage people, check out the podcast, The Edges of Lean. You can most likely find it whatever app you're using to listen to my podcast. Just go search The Edges of Lean. Bella and I are both part of a group, mastermind group, networking group called the Lean Communicators. So we encourage people to go to leancommunicators.com, and you can discover the other podcasts of the other people we're collaborating with. So I'm thankful you've been part of that group for a little bit over a year since we started that, Bella.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate it. I've learned so much in that group. It's been a huge help to me in moving the podcast forward. And I want to give a shout out to the leancommunicators.com website, because it updates constantly as people put out new episodes. You're going to see the latest episodes, and chances are what you're looking for is there already or will be soon.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that group, it's been great because everybody's learning, everybody's teaching and sharing something, and that's what that kind of group is supposed to be about. So that's been really good.
About the people.
Yeah, there we go. The people who make the podcasts. And I thank the people who come on to be a guest, like today, Bella Englebach. Again, her website is leanforhumans.com, and you can learn more about her book and her work and the podcast and everything else that's there. So Bella, thank you. Really, really appreciate having you here as a guest today.
Thank you very much.